Last week we discussed something of the legendary and lore behind Wagner's great cycle of the Ring. And this evening we must approach the New Testament of this epic, the Wagnerian cycle of the Grail. And as in the previous cycle, he drew heavily upon what might be termed folklore, but particularly upon the legends of the troubadours. We have tried at various times in lectures and books to tell you something about the troubadours, these mysterious singers and ballad writers who have been passed off largely as a band of wandering minstrels, but who actually represented a very closely integrated, highly organized group of men with very deep and real spiritual, philosophical, and even political activities in the backs of their minds. The troubadours seem to have inherited something of the mysteries of the ancient Orphic bards, and like the Druidic bards, they were not only the perpetuators of ancient tales, but they composed a great many, or created new patterns and arrangements, by which they deepened and broadened the implications of folklore and legendary. At a time when frank statement was impossible, these priests of secret cults exercised a tremendous influence in Europe, and many of the great epics which have descended to us as the priceless examples of early medieval literature are traceable directly to them, and upon the tremendous store of lore which they left, countless more recent dramas, stories, legends have been built. Now, in the case of the Parsival story, we know that we are dealing with a very definite collection of these cyclic myths, a collection which includes not only the Parsival Lohengrin stories, but also the entire cycle known as the Arthurian legend, or the story of the age of chivalry, and much, if not all, of the legend of Roland and the paladins of Charlemagne, king of the Franks. We have in the cycles of these legends many implications of deeper and double meanings, but only from the perspective of a more enlightened era can we examine in some detail the interlocking of these stories. We have to therefore assume that while it is not impossible that the Arthurian cycle had a certain foundation in history, that it was largely an embellishment. Perhaps some small and inconsequential group of events became the basis of that great cycle which Tennyson has preserved for us in the Idylls of the King. The same is true of the story of Charlemagne. The historical Charles the Great is not in every way the Charlemagne of the epic cycle. It is quite possible that there may be some historical foundation for the Lohengrin epic in Belgium, and there is perhaps a remote historical ground for the great cycle of Parsival. Actually, however, these historical elements are of no great importance. They have so completely submerged in the larger meaning that it is scarcely necessary to re-identify them. For practical purposes, we of course realize that the Grail cycle, as Wagner took hold of it, was a scattered group of works. Several, particularly the Titurel stories, arising in Germany and actually traceable directly to the great bardic singers of the troubadours. While mentioning this, we might also note that St. Francis of Assisi was also a troubadour. So was Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio. All of these men, therefore, may be suspected, and their writings are always suspect. To take the writings of Dante, for example, when he explains how he climbs out of the pits of the underworld on the body of Satan, this seems like wild fantasy. And his romance, his romantic childhood attachment for Beatrice, appears to be merely the story of a very emotional and impressionable youth. But behind all these things are other intents. And as we begin to penetrate them, we realize why it was necessary and how it was necessary in those days of tremendous mental oppression to hide very choice and important truths in these fables and myths. The story of the Grail cycle begins apparently at the time when the Roman Emperor Vespasian was laying siege to the city of Jerusalem. At that time, he was assisted by the leaders and upholders and followers of a group or tribe called the Senaborden. This family was of unknown origin, but from a study of the names of the sons and relatives of the house, we may suspect an Arabic background. Now, this is all the more interesting when we discover that the oldest form that we have of the Parsival story came from the Arabs of Spain during a certain period in their sphere of cultural influence. One time, of course, they dominated all European thought. This Senaborden family intermarried with the nobility of Europe, and as a result of the help given to the Roman emperor, they became a powerful family after the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. And among the descendants of this family, after several generations, was Titurel, the first king of the Grail. Now, this man is also subjected to a wide cycle of myths, and historically, almost nothing is known about him. He is tied in, however, by the troubadours into other cycles other than the Grail cycle, and occurs for us in a number of different forms and appearances. It is said that this was the one, however, this great and noble prince, who received a vision from heaven, instructing him to build the great temple for the Grail. And he was told by angelic voices where to select the place and how to go about this wonderful project to which he was predestined and foreordained. The place selected was said to have been on the mountains between Christian and Muslim Spain, in a location difficult to establish, although efforts have been made to give it historical orientation. Anyway, this palace was called the Palace on Mount Salvat, and apparently it was patterned after the concept of the mysterious Lodge of the Adepts in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. Now, you might think that such a thing would be a long way from the thinking of Christian Europe, even in the days of the troubadours. But we know that the Mongols, even before the time of Genghis Khan, had been quite active in trading along the caravan routes with Europe, and many strange and interesting legends, bits of folklore, tales had come along these routes. Among them, many that later show up in the journals of Columbus, who seems to have been very sensitive to this type of thinking. In any event, the contact between Europe and Asia was not as thin as we think. As a result of a council of the churches much earlier, the Nestorian Christians had been declared heretical and had been sent into the desert and wilderness with the hope that they would perish. These Nestorians, however, were able to survive, and they carried on and they journeyed into far places. And there are Christian monuments today in China, raised before the 5th century, bearing witness to the presence of Nestorian missionaries. Thus, there was a direct contact between the Near East and the Mediterranean and China as early as the 2nd century A.D., a contact which led to a considerable exchange of art, culture, literature, even music and language. This is not any more surprising, of course, than the still earlier contact established in India, particularly in the Gandhara region, as a result of the expeditions of Alexander the Great. So the East and West were not as strange or separate as Kipling might cause us to believe, and the contacts and legends of these two regions were fairly well established. During the reign of Kublai Khan, the illustrious descendant of the great Genghis, a delegation was sent to the Pope from Mongolia. This delegation visited the Pope while he was enthroned in Avignon as a result of one of the eternal ecclesiastical feuds that were dividing the church at that time. This delegation told him, among other things, that there existed in Asia at that time a Christian empire, a very strange and mysterious place, ruled over by John the Presbyter, a very mysterious and elusive person. And John the Presbyter himself sent epistles to the Pope, to the Doge of Venice, to the Dukes of Florence, and to many other important persons of his time, always signing himself John the Presbyter, King of Kings, Emperor of all the world. Now this modest title, of course, he came by legitimately because that was also the official title of Genghis Khan, who very nearly made it a fact. If it hadn't been for a poor little country that is now having a lot of trouble, Hungary, he probably would have been king of Europe as well as of Asia. In any event, this mysterious John the Presbyter was a force to conjure with, and he had quite a part to play in the development of America, inasmuch as the early voyagers seeking a new route to Asia were primarily concerned in visiting the court of Prester John, King of Kings, Emperor of all the world. Now this man was so fabled in his glory and his greatness that it is said that he lived in a wonderful world surrounded by a desert of gold. And in this sea of golden sands swam fishes of emeralds and jade and silver. And he was served by a tremendous retinue. 72 kings were his body servants. 144,000 dukes waited on him. And his chefs consisted of 72 bishops. He really had quite an establishment out there somewhere. The only difficulty is no one was ever able to find it. And although the letters and messages which he sent are still in existence, no one ever discovered who Prester John was, or what his mysterious empire was like. We are not surprised, therefore, that he arises in the songs of the troubadours. And Prester John plays a very important part in our Grail story, as we will see in a moment. But anyway, in the great cycle of Roland, the story of the hero of the court of Charlemagne, the Sir Galahad, the Robin Hood, the Siegfried of the Charlemagne cycle, we learn of the wonderful help that Prester John sent to Charlemagne. And we learn also that by magic heroes traveled through the air to visit the empire of Prester John. It was all very curious, all very secret, and much in the spirit of the strange things reported by Apollonius of Tyana when he returned from India, or the even stranger and more wonderful things described by Sir Marco Polo in his experiences. Polo's stories of the magic, mystery, sorcery, and wonder of the East, these stories were considered so extravagant that on his deathbed he was asked to recant and correct his extravagances in order that he might not go into the other world as a branded liar. Marco Polo on his deathbed said he'd only told half the story, and the only way he could go into the other world as a liar was by taking back what he had said. So the fate of Sir Marco in the other world is still open to some controversy. But all these legends seemingly had a pattern. They have a place in the world, because after Parsival had finished his kingship of the Grail, it is said in one of the most serious of the great stories that he journeyed to the east and took the cup to the court of Prester John, where it has remained forever since. Also, when the time came for the great King Titurel to die, after he had ruled the Grail kingdom for 400 years, it is said that before he passed, he also journeyed to the east and returned to the kingdom of Prester John. Thus, this peculiar combination of myths interblends, ties together, and seems to make quite a story. Now, the story of the Grail section of this, for a moment, is also a wonderful and fantastic story. In the first place, we have in the old writings of the troubadours two forms of the term or statements signifying the Grail. We have the sangre real, which literally means the blood of the king. And we have the sang grail, which means the holy cup. These terms are interused in a very strange way, seemingly indicating two distinct meanings. Where the cup came from originally, of course, is a matter also of controversy. Obviously, it is much older than the Last Supper, because it occurs in the rites and rituals of the Druids. It is almost certainly the mysterious cup of Dionysus, the cup of, or chalice of ecstasy. It appears in an entirely different form in the cup of the guildmasters of Europe, and it returns again and again in the different legends. When you go back through the poems and songs of the troubadours, you find several very interesting things. In one of these things, one of these stories, the Holy Grail is described not as a cup but a book. This is a peculiar implication that might take further analysis. In another work, it is described as an oracle, and it is said that a voice spoke from it, revealing all the mysteries of the world. In most instances, however, it is regarded as some kind of a drinking vessel, often associated with song, sometimes with a magic cauldron, such as that of the ancient British deity Ceridwen, whose magic cauldron, like the kettle of the witches of Macbeth, was used for divers purposes. This cauldron also occurs as the mysterious skull cup of the ancient Nordic mysteries, from which the neophyte for initiation drank of the blood of the god. This cup containing the cleansing blood goes back into nearly all of the old religions of the world. There is a Kabbalistic legend, which incidentally also began in southern Spain during a period in which Muslim tolerance permitted a very powerful growth of Jewish mysticism, that this cup was originally taken from an emerald called Exilus, and had been the crown jewel of the archangel Lucifer, and was struck from his head with the sword of Michael at the time of the war in heaven. This goes back to a period in which documentation will be extremely difficult. Therefore, we can only report such things as are told of this matter. This cup as a green jewel did have quite a long history, however, and during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon I was in a position to examine what was originally believed to be the original green cup taken from the crest jewel of Lucifer. He had it brought to Paris and examined by experts, and they discovered that it was green glass and of not too ancient a manufacture, so that the relic might be open to some controversy also. But in any event, the Kabbalistic legend is that this stone falling from heaven was concealed beneath the surface of the earth and became the foundation of the footstool of the world. It is quite an involved story, but it seems to suggest that in some way it represented a great power, knowledge, or mystery, that like the famous stone cables of the Mosaic Law, which were originally said to have been sapphires, that this stone had its religious place because it became the foundation upon which man built his quest for spiritual growth. In other words, man, having followed the fallen angel, built upon the mysterious foundation of this green jewel. And upon this he was to build his way back to heaven. All these legends are not directly related to Parsival, but they belong very closely with the story. The actual story itself, as developed by Wagner, is like The Ring, an interesting combination of the legends of the troubadours and a private, personal brand of Wagnerian mythology. As in the other instances, he selected what he wanted and what he could use. In commenting upon this peculiarity, Bailey, who was a great student of these symbols and related matters, said that in his estimation, if ever an ancient troubadour was reborn, it was Richard Wagner, because he had the same strange, wonderful gift as Eckenbach and many of the others of creating what was useful to him, and to bring all these elements together to tell a new story and a new picture. Now, one thing you will observe always, especially if you have attended the opera, you will realize that Parsival, as an opera, is about the nearest thing in music drama to what might be termed a high mass. It is a very highly religious thing, and is usually given at the Metropolitan in New York at least once on Good Friday every year. The Good Friday spell is certainly strengthened by the use of this tremendous mystical opera. Yet the more you analyze the opera, the more you realize that you're not dealing with Orthodox Christianity at all. You're not dealing with the background that you might expect to find. You are dealing with what one English author has referred to as the secret church of the Holy Grail. And this secret church of the Holy Grail is a general term now applied to our concept of mysticism. Back in the early days, when the church was still an all-powerful physical institution, there was already a division within the body of the believers. This division was, of course, encouraged and strengthened by what were called the heretics, or those who had never really accepted the orthodox overtones of the church. These heretics involved the descendants of the Greek scholars that had once flourished in Rome. They represented the various religions that the Roman Empire had conquered. They represented merchants and travelers and statesmen from non-Christian countries who, for one reason or another, took up temporary abode within the boundaries of Christendom. And they represented, in general, an instinct on the part of man, an instinct to search for the internal experience of God, rather than to depend entirely upon the ministrations of a clergy. We remember the line in which the great general enters the porch of the temple and the priest meets him. And the priest stands as though to bar the way. And the great general says, "Whose house is this?" And the priest says, "This is the house of God, sire." The general said, "Then, man, step aside. I shall go my own way." Now, in some way, this spirit rose strongly in Europe, perpetuating the heresy of Manes, perpetuating the Muslim contact on the fringe of Christendom, the old Egyptian mysteries which still survived as philosophical institutions. And in the early church there did arise a powerful stream of mysticism. This mysticism was distinctly unorthodox. It was dedicated to the fact that each human being had within himself the power to seek inwardly for the source of light and truth, and that mysteriously and wonderfully his own heart was the matchless altar of his soul, and that in his heart he could commune with God. And we realized gradually that the Grail became the symbol of the inner sanctuary of the human heart, within which flows forever the blood of life. And that the Grail, therefore, was the secret altar which man, as priest, served in his own nature without benefit of clergy. This matchless altar, this wonderful internal mystery, attracted not only those within Christendom, but also divided the orthodox individual from a band of mystics who were always outside of the orthodoxy of the church. Sometimes they appeared to conform. Sometimes, as in the case of the Minnesang and the Meistersingers, they actually held their meetings within the cathedrals and churches. No one suspected exactly what was behind it all. But one interesting and wonderful thing you will note in this whole great cycle, whether it be in Charlemagne or the Arthurian legend or in the Grail story of Parsival. Although Parsival is a completely religious drama, no member of the clergy is introduced at any time. There is no priest. The King of the Grail himself plays the part of the priest, raises the cup in the Eucharistic ceremony, and therefore the great order of chivalry in total represented a laity priesthood, or a priestly laity, that performed their various secret rites and their holy sacraments without the cooperation or presence of the vested clergy. This is a very important point, because it has to do with the descent of mysticism, which carries on all the way down through the medieval period into the Kabbalists, the Rosicrucians, the alchemists, the Illuminists, and finally down into what we would term today the metaphysicians, or those who are studying various religious beliefs as individuals and seeking to grow from within themselves according to their own personal needs. This mysterious Church of the Holy Grail was therefore gradually assumed to be the true repository of the esoteric Christian doctrine. It was supposed to be the soul or the spirit or the hidden body which had the true doctrine, which it had received from the Gnosis, from the Neoplatonists, and from all the secret societies of the ancient world, from the mysteries which alone possessed the true keys to the sacred rites and ceremonies. We therefore find in the story of the knight-errant whether it be in Lohengrin or Parsival or King Arthur's circle, we find that the knight performs his vigil. And like the initiates of ancient mysteries, he was always divided into 3 grades or orders. Incidentally, the same thing existed exactly in China. And I'm doing some research now on the Heaven-Earth Association, or the Hong Society, which also divides in precisely the same way, has the same objectives, and is also distinguished by the absolute absence of clergy. So here on the opposite side of the world was a precisely identical phenomenon. The 3 orders of the Grail, or the 3 orders of the Arthurian cycle, were called the orders of the page, of the squire, and of the knight. The page began his training, began his preparation for a life of knighthood. Later he was elevated to the condition or state of a squire, and accompanied his master or the knight to whom he was assigned on various labors and purposes. And finally, after appropriate interval and time, he was knighted and became a true and full-fledged member of this order of chivalry. He advanced not only by valuable service and by conscientious learning of the things we might associate with the feudal system of aristocracy, he advanced by study, by various dedications, and by various renunciations. For instance, during the great age of the temple, when the Knights Templars of Jerusalem were advancing in their way to become a great world power, no knight of the temple was permitted to own anything. He had to go back to the vow of absolute poverty. He had to spend practically all of his spare time doing one of 2 things: polishing his armor or praying to his God. Those were his labors. By polishing his armor, he proved that he was ever watchful and vigilant to the duties and labors of chivalry. And the rest of the time he lived as a monk, having no earthly possessions, not permitted even to play cards or to play chess or checkers or any game that was fashionable at the time. He could only polish his armor and pray to his God. So these orders were not quite as flamboyant as Mark Twain's account of King Arthur's court might imply. They were really very serious. And we may also add that these knights were not constantly engaged in the glorious exploit of killing dragons and rescuing damsels in distress. There simply just wasn't that many dragons, and there were not so many damsels in distress at that time. All these legends are purely stories to conceal the great purposes of knighthood. And these purposes again take on another group of symbolisms and become the labors of alchemy 200 or 300 years later. All these are stories of human beings seeking truth. Therefore, all these knightly and chivalrous orders are grouped together under the title Orders of the Quest. They were groups of individuals seeking truth according to the dictates of their own conscience, seeking it within themselves, seeking it in far and distant places, not by traveling out to hunt for dragons, but to seek the wise and the good in various parts of the world. But they were always alert and ready with their polished and sharpened weapons to fight the 3 great monsters which at that time burdened all the world, these monsters being ignorance, superstition, and fear. These were their tasks, and they were the leaders and vanguards of the great humanistic movements that were later to come forth in the positive and outward preachments of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Thomas Paine. These were the defenders of the rights of man against church and state, against any enemy that sought to prevent the human being from growing according to nature's laws and nature's will. So the legends sprang up around these principles, and of course we would naturally expect them to take their place in the Parsival account. Now, Parsival occupies a rather complicated situation when you come to analyze him. The drawing of his character by Wagner is quite confused. In the early part of the story, he is presented to us as the guileless one, or as some rather mistakenly call him, the fool. Actually, Parsival was not the fool in the sense of one stupid, but rather he was the pure of heart who had not yet discovered worldliness, who had not experienced deceit or evil as we know it. He certainly, however, was not exactly a brilliant or informed person. And the first introduction we have to him in the opera is where, with his little bow and arrow, he shoots the swan and kills it. The swan, which is the symbol of the bird of great verse. The swan in ancient times was the ancient symbol of extrasensory perception, or the intuitive faculties of human consciousness. Therefore, in the killing of the swan, Parsival has in some way blunted or dulled his own internal vision. This is the implication of the story. By the time in which the story opens, we have a whole cast of characters arranged for our consideration. We have Parsival, the one who knew not where he came from, who he was, or who his parents were. He knew only that his mother was the sorrow of the world, and his father he had never known. He knew also that in some mysterious way, through his mother, he was associated with this great family of the Senaborden, because actually Parsival belonged to what was called the stem of the Grail Kings. Within him was the same blood that was in Titurel and Amfortas. But he did not know this because he had wandered far. So we have a new story now, and if we watch the descent or generations of the Grail Kings, we will find that they parallel exactly the older Nibelungen account of the descent of the Volsungs. Because the Grail Kings, the stem of the Grail, is the stem of the redeeming power. And as the Volsungs represented the descent or involutionary processes of consciousness, the Senaborden, the great stem of the Grail, represents the evolutionary development of the entire story of human growth and the unfoldment of man's internal spiritual faculties. At the time when Parsival appears, Amfortas is king of the Grail. Now, Amfortas is introduced in the opera carried upon a litter by knights because he has passed through a terrible and grievous injury. It seems that some time before, following an ancient Persian belief that light and darkness cannot exist apart, that when the magnificent temple at Mount Salvat was built upon the peak of the mountains, another strange and mysterious palace was built in the depth of the valley nearby. And this was built by enchantment and sorcery and magic, and was ruled over by a strange Eastern magician who is called in the opera Klingsaur, who is the adversary. He is the symbol of illusion, delusion, worldliness. He is the prince of this world, referred to by Christ, who has nothing in truth. And in order to be truly a first-class black magician, Klingsaur had built a weir, a magic net, or a magic garden, a thing to capture human souls. And he had made it very beautiful, and he had populated it with mysterious beings that were like the Peris and Uris of the Arabian Nights entertainment. Mysterious, fabulous creatures, beautiful so-called flower maidens. And I would like to point out that in the last 25 years, there's been a marked improvement in the flower maidens at the Metropolitan Opera. Up to that time, most of the flower maidens were chosen from rather buxom Teutonic sopranos and assorted groups, and were dressed in flowing gossamer that was really a little the worse for having been stored away in the Met for a number of years. But after a while, in more recent years, some new mind and life came into the Metropolitan, and now we have seen the last 8 or 9 years a very careful reconstruction of Wagner's original concept. The flower maidens are now all in Oriental costumes, resembling as closely as possible the characters from the Arabian Nights entertainment with which they are associated. And Klingsor himself emerges like the magician of Aladdin's lamp as a definitely sinister Asiatic, rather than as a rather medieval magician, with a type with the tall pointed black hat and the black robe covered with stars, which is more or less passed out of fashion. But both of these groups have greatly improved with a little thought, and the story takes on much more of its original and intended coloring. Now, in the Grail Castle were kept the two great relics of the Grail mystery, associated with the mystery of the Passion of Christ. One was the Sun Grail, or the cup of the Last Supper. Others say it is the cup that caught the blood of Christ when he was hanging on the cross. This is the cup that is supposed to have been held by Joseph of Arimathea. And it is the result of this phase of the legend that we have the rise of the great cycle at Glastonbury. And it is said that Joseph of Arimathea, accompanied by the sister of Saint Veronica, carried the cup and other relics, including the crown of thorns, to Britain, where they were placed in the crypt of the old church that stood where later Glastonbury was built. It is this search for the Glastonbury chalice which has involved a number of Grail expeditions in the past, and it is said that the wreath of thorns was planted in the ground and has resulted in a peculiar plant called the Glastonbury thorn, which grows presumably particularly at that place. Of course, the handkerchief of Saint Veronica is interesting because it is another case where we have confused names. The so-called lady, Saint Veronica, actually isn't a person at all. The name is Veronica is from Vera Icon, which means the true likeness or the true appearance of the face of the Master. We know that in the Eastern Church they have their icons or pictures of saints, and the Vera Icon is the true likeness and has gradually been corrupted into Veronica. In any event, this cup and the spear of Longinus, the centurion whose spear pierced the side of Christ, the cup of the Last Supper or of the blood of Christ, the legends are not clear, and as I told you, they've spelled the word two ways, so that's very confusing. These are supposed to have been brought to Monsalvat and placed in the great sanctuary of the Grail Temple. After a number of knights and squires and pages had wandered down from the top of the great mountain temple and had become ensnared in the wiles of Klingsor and his enchanted garden, Amfortas felt called upon to rid his knightly region of this menace. So he took the spear of Longinus and descended into the valley to do battle with Klingsor. And when he arrived there, he hurled the spear, but because of the fact that this in itself was a strange desecration of this sacred instrument, it did not reach its mark. Instead, Klingsor grasped the spear, turned, and wounded Amfortas with it. This was a very terrible thing, because it was a wound that would not heal. And the Grail King returned to his castle with this bleeding wound that never completely healed and bled profusely, almost fatally, every year at Good Friday. The story of this wound seems to tell us, in a simple moral way, that we cannot use good with which to do evil even in the name of good. Amfortas should never have attempted with violence to destroy Klingsor, because he merely did what we all do when we seek revenge. He made another evil, and two evil actions will not equal a right one. So Amfortas was punished for his audacity in using the spear for a purpose of destruction, even to destroy evil. So when Parsival arrives on the scene in the drama, Amfortas is already wounded, suffering from this terrible injury that will not heal. Now at the time also, there was a grand old knight there, a wonderful old sage, scholar, counselor, wise man, who is called Gunamons. And this man is the teacher of the young pages and squires. And he is a venerable man who is particularly remembered for the fact that he is able to sing for nearly 45 minutes, apparently without taking his breath. Some of his numbers to the uninitiated become, shall we say, slightly tedious. But in any event, he is a wonderful person, and probably the tedium is that which all school children suffer from whenever they are expected to learn anything. But anyway, Gunamons is able to tell Parsival the story of the Grail, and to explain to him the terrible curse that hangs over it as the result of the wounding of Amfortas. And he also tells him something of a prophecy, that there is one to come who, like Galahad in the Arthurian cycle, is the pure of heart, the one in whom there is no evil, the one who is to be called the guileless one, the one who does good simply from being good, and about whom there is a legend that when he appears, he will restore the glory of the Grail Empire. Now we learn as we go into both the Wagnerian and the old troubadours' accounts that the Grail Castle on Mount Salvat is not just a place where these knights gather for the great sacraments of Good Friday and Easter. This is the center or the capital of an invisible empire, and except when they are present for the great ceremony of the Eucharist, the Knights of the Grail go forth to all parts of the world, serving human beings in every region and in every land. And they are bound together, and they have many pages and squires. And this forms an invisible network of good. They answer the prayers of the needy and of the sick and the afflicted, and they champion the cause of right wherever they can. And this occurs, of course, in the story of Lohengrin. For when the poor young lady is in great need and falls on her knees praying for a champion to protect her and to see that right is done, then this swan knight comes out of the unknown in his little boat and becomes her champion. And these swan knights, knights of the same swan that Parsival killed in his ignorance, these knights are the secret benefactors of mankind. And there is no question in the world that the whole cycle represents the school of the adepts and its mysterious membership, and is a symbol, of course, of the invisible government of the earth, seated in what the Mongolian calls Shambhala, the great city of the north, the high place of the world, the Meru of India. All of these sacred mountains, the Olympus of the Greeks, the mysterious mountain of revelation, all these are the high place, or the mysterious top of the world. And even the psalmist in his extremity cries out that he shall lift up his eyes unto the hills from whence cometh his help. So these high places always represented the invisible world, or the high vibratory currents through which the messages of the needy are carried to the ears of the servants of mankind. In Buddhism it is the gracious Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, whose large and ever-attentive ears hear the sorrows, sighs, and needs of all human beings. So the knights apparently have this wonderful power to discern inwardly the requirements of everyone. Now Gurnemanz is a kind of guide. He occurs frequently in this kind of literature. We find him in the Arthurian cycle as he appears in the form of Merlin, the wise man, the ancient one, who explains to Arthur his destiny and who was the servant of his father. It is ancient Merlin who arranges the ordeal of the sword cast into the anvil, which is again the sword of Sigurd in the oak, the sword which, drawn forth, proves the knight to be of royal origin and kingly order. This, of course, is the sword of consciousness, which must be drawn forth out of the body before kingship can be established. In the Indian classic, it is said that it is the sword of quick detachment with which man cuts the snaky branches of the tree of illusion. And this is the good handy sword of Alexander the Great, with which he cut the Gordian knot and ended the tangle of the ages, which man in turn must also do. So this sword later to occur again as Excalibur, the symbol of the true knighthood, the symbol of enlightened will and purpose, by which all adversaries are overcome. This sword of Merlin and all these legends and myths tie together, and Merlin finally goes to sleep in a strange castle of glass under the enchantments of Vivian, and no one sees him again. This doesn't exactly happen with Gurnemanz, but Gurnemanz is the same old guide, the same kindly one. And Jung, in his studies of psychoanalysis, points out that the dream of the old man is nearly always the dream of the teacher or the overself. So that Gurnemanz represents the strange internal overload of consciousness which man has, the great ages of experience that lie locked within his soul and are available to him when he is able to open his own inner consciousness. Perhaps this is the same meaning as Virgil leading Dante through the Inferno, and in the Egyptian ritual of the dead, the mysterious being Anubis, one of the gods, who leads the soul of the deceased through all the tortuous passageways of Amentet. Always there is the guide, and he occurs in practically every one of the ancient secret orders and societies. At least he is present in the form of not an infallible one, but a kindly and learned elder knight, who is past the age of battle, but is still most useful as the teacher and tutor of the coming knights of the Grail. We are also introduced at this time to another delightful character who is more or less of an innovation, rather strongly Wagnerian, although there is some substantiation for her in other places, and that is the character of Kundry. Kundry is probably built around at least the concept of an ancient legend involving Salome. It is said that after Salome was responsible for the death of John the Baptist, a curse was placed upon her and she could not die and became the female equivalent of the wandering Jew, and therefore lived on through the ages to atone for having slain the herald or the baptizer who was to prepare the way of the Lord. In any event, Kundry seems to take upon herself a series of attributes. She is at one moment Salome, at another moment she takes on some of the characteristics of Mary the Magdalene, And in different places and in different parts of the story, she occurs in various roles. I think we should note, of course, that her name is very interesting and reminiscent. Whether Wagner had this point in mind, we do not know, but he seems to have been the one who named her. We are not able to learn too much of any previous use of that particular name. He called her Kundry, and she was represented usually dressed in robes of serpents, or with a magnificent gown in the better operatic version, on which is embroidered or enjeweled a great serpent. The word Kundry suggests your Hindu term Kundalini, the serpent power. And this is intensified in the case of Kundry by the fact that she has a divided allegiance. When she is herself, when she is free, she strives for all that is good and wants to serve the Knights of the Grail. In fact, in the early part of the opera, she is just returning from a long journey to the most distant parts of the earth to find a medicine which will heal the wound of Amfortas. If, however, Klingsor demands it, he has the strange power of holding her in a spell of hypnosis. And when this happens, she then becomes the servant of evil. Here then seemingly is again a reference to the serpent power, or the Kundali Shakti of the ancient tantric magic of India. Because used for good, this serpent power becomes the agent of divinity. But used willfully for black magic or evil, it becomes a destroying force, which also will finally destroy the person who thus abuses it. So Kundry is introduced into the story as a kind of mystery woman who seemingly is of great age, who seemingly knows all the secrets of the world, and at another moment is a very helpless, very sweet, very kind, innocent person, depending on whether she is mistress of herself at the moment or whether she is under the spell of Klingsor. Now, we have mentioned already Amfortas and his difficulties, and of course in the opera it is assumed that Titurel has just died, and therefore that at the coming of the great Eucharist the final ceremonies or rituals for him will be performed. In addition to these characters, there are several lesser ones, but for the most part the opera moves around this group of primary persons. There are knights and retainers, and of course a bevy of flower maidens, and the inevitable ballet without which German opera at that time was not considered even remotely possible, especially when it was being paid for by the Prince of Bavaria. But in any event, the story develops around these characters. The opera begins, strangely enough, at a high point. It opens in the gardens of the Grail Castle, or on the sides of the mountains where the Grail Castle is located. And Parsival, having wandered thus innocently and mysteriously into the assembly, and having no decent, reasonable, or probable answers for anything, arouses the curiosity of Gunamans. The old knight says to himself, here is certainly a person who matches all the requirements of the ancient prophecy. He is certainly ignorant, he is certainly young, he is certainly inexperienced. Perhaps he is the guileless one who is to redeem this tragedy of the Grail Knights. And hoping that thus this may be true, Gunamans escorts, leads, and sort of pushes the young man up the long trail toward the Castle of the Grail to Opera. But the story is that after having failed to recognize any part of the sacred ceremony, Parsival, who certainly is the form of the world hero, very much in disguise, representing also the human soul very much in disguise. Man, standing in the presence of the great Eucharistic ceremony of life and finding that it means nothing to him. Man, standing ever in the presence of the temple of the infinite, where the mystery of creation is unfolding in a great pageant ritual around him, sees nothing, understands nothing, and finds that the great mystery of growth and of God's manifestation is meaningless to him. So he leaves, assisted in his departure by the aggravated Gunamons, and finds himself wandering slowly down the mountainside until he arrives dangerously close to the evil garden of enchantment over which Klingsor rules supreme. Now, Klingsor is no fool, although his ways are not the ways of righteousness. And Klingsor was really a little smarter than Gunamons, because Klingsor, looking into the depths of his magic mirror, was able to realize that this guileless one coming down the mountain, the one who knew neither good nor evil, could be the greatest menace of all. Because there is nothing more dangerous in all the world to evil than innocence. And it was up to Klingsor to make certain that this condition of innocence was remedied as quickly as possible. Because if he could cause Parsival to lose this innocence, then the great prophecy of the Grail could not be fulfilled. In order to achieve this end, Kundry calls upon his ally, Klingsor calls upon his ally Kundry, forces her to accept his hypnotic rule, and she appears rising through the earth like some strange goddess of Greek mythology, and she is forced to do the bidding of this magician. And he selects her as the temptress for Parsival. So we in due time see Parsival arriving in the magic garden, where he is surrounded by all of the Houris and the Arabian damsels from the story of the caliphs of Baghdad. And in the midst of them appears Kundry, who is now the servant of evil, who is now playing her role of Salome. And she uses every enticement possible to try to capture his imagination and to try to lure him into the mysteries of mortal love. She only almost captures him on one occasion, however, and that is when she rather takes a maternal attitude and begins to be sorry for him and begins to explain to him the mystery of his own origin. When this happens, Parsival is almost captured. But he is not captured by her human love as woman for man, but rather by the strange over-atmosphere of her almost religious maternal interest which suddenly arises in her in spite of herself. She becomes apparently desperately sorry for the boy and wants him to really know something about himself. This peculiar complex in her disposition is climaxed, however, when Parsival, suddenly sensing or realizing perhaps the dawning awaking of consciousness in his own soul, suddenly feels this terrible pain shoot through him and feels within himself the wound of Amfortas. He suddenly realizes exactly the meaning of it all, what it signifies, everything. The great pain of the wounded Grail King strikes him. And in that moment, he awakens. He casts off the spell and escapes entirely from the mystery of the magic garden. In the meantime, Klingsor, who with his magic has been watching everything very carefully, suddenly realizes that his plot has gone awry. So he appears upon the battlement of his castle, carrying now in his hand the spear of Longinus, which he has captured from Amfortas. And in order to destroy Parsival, he now hurls the spear at him, And in the drama, this is one of the most beautiful and dramatic episodes, and it is always spoiled in the opera by having the spear run on a trolley. It is one of the saddest things that can ever happen to a great dramatic moment in an opera. But in any event, the spear misses its end because the trolley wire doesn't go in that direction, and floats in the air over the head of Parsival if the technician is reasonably accurate, which he is not always, by the way. And Parsival grasps the spear, turns it upward, causing the point to be raised, and makes with it the sign of the cross. The moment he does so, the entire enchanted castle dissolves. Klingsor and his flower maidens and even Kundry seem to vanish together. The garden changes into a wilderness, and nothing remains but a desert such as that of some distant, unfertile area of the Sahara. Nothing remains but ruin. And carrying aloft the raised and pointed spear of Longinus, Parsival moves triumphantly off stage. The next part of the opera conveys a very interesting idea to which we have to go back to the legends to get some of the explanation. Having raised the point of the spear, which again probably refers to the spinal fire, which he has now elevated, and has thereby escaped from the evil of Klingsor, Parsival now suddenly realizes the true meaning of virtue, has made his initiation into the mysteries, and has passed the tests and ordeals which were commonly portrayed in all similar rites in the ancient Egyptian, Greek, Roman temples. He now has an understanding, but he no longer knows where the Grail Kingdom is. And in the great legend, as it is told in the Cicero, and in the other rites and later legends of the troubadours, it follows that Parsival wanders throughout the whole world. He goes everywhere as a strange, lonely person, carrying always the spear, and never being able to find the mysterious castle on the top of the mountain. He cannot get back to it. He follows path after path, but they lead only to darkness. We find him standing in one legend by the shores of the sea, looking out across the infinite mystery of the waves. He does not know where to go. He now, however, has only one thing within him, the longing to return to Montsalvat. Something is pulling him, but he does not know how to get there. And slowly we see his person change. By degrees he takes on more and more almost the attributes and aspects of some ascetic or holy man of the East. And in order to conceal his identity, he covers his robes and garments with obscuring vestments and hides his identity, and finally is known only as a black knight, robed from head to foot in black, and carrying in his hand the spear. This darkness, this obscurity, represents undoubtedly the descent of consciousness into matter, into body, and the struggle between body and soul to restore the internal faculties of apperception which have been brought into play by resisting the temptation in the Garden of Illusion. Of course, the Garden of Illusion is the material world. It is equivalent. Again, we are dealing almost exactly with the legend of the prodigal son, and we are dealing again with the Gnostic poem, the Hymn of the Robe of Glory. These are always the wanderer. Here our Parsival is Ulysses, returning from the Trojan War, seeking through dangers and tests and trials and tribulations to return to his own far distant native land. And in the legends, in the great cycles of legends, which Wagner does not attempt to use, of course, Parsival has countless adventures. Countless times he thinks he has found his way. Many times he believes that success is near, only to have the grail and the mystery evaporate, disappear, vanish. until he becomes the symbol of the wanderer, the heaven seeker, and the perfect embodiment of the whole order of chivalry which we call this order of the quest. His great quest is now for the return to the heaven world or the overworld, the soul seeking again its heavenly estate, having taken on the dark vestment of mortality. But in the opera we are not treated to all of these numerous episodes. We are allowed to return for that very long soliloquy by Gounomans, which marks one of the most beautiful parts of the music, but one which is a little difficult for the amateur to fully appreciate, and that is the great Good Friday spell of Gounomans. Here the old knight, now much older and much more venerable, is in front of his little flower-covered cottage by the side of the Grail Palace, or in the mountain woods nearby. And he, of course, recapitulates the whole story in this very long narrative song which he sings. And he tells much of the sorrows and miseries and mysteries of the way. By now, Kundry has returned more or less to her normal estate. She is no longer serving evil. She has become a very beautiful penitent now. Salome has disappeared, and in her place has come the Magdalene. And she is trying everything possible to help and to serve. She is still trying to find some remedy for Amfortas, who is still suffering in great pain and agony. And then, after a reasonable length of time, they observe a stranger coming. He is coming up the mountain, slowly, painfully, wearily. And he is dressed entirely in black, and he has a black helmet, and the visor is closed, but he is holding aloft a spear. And this one wandering up the mountain is not recognized either by Kundry or Gounomans at that stage, and they wonder who is coming. And of course, hope and fear, all the emotions that have to do with this ancient prophecy, arise within them as to whether this stranger is someone fated to bring good or ill to the company of the Grail Knights. And finally, this dark-clothed one reaches the little flat area of land in front of the house of Gounomans, and then he suddenly drives the spear shaft down into the ground so that the point is up. And from the point of the spear shine and drop little globules of light, and immediately it is evident that this is the spear of Longinus, and that this is indeed a strange and important person who has come, because he is restoring to the knights the spear which pierced the side of Christ. Having risen from kneeling in front of the spear in prayer, the mysterious person removes his dark helmet and stands revealed as Parsival. But it is no longer the Parsival we saw before. In this strange interval, something seems to have happened, because the Parsival who is revealed when the helmet is withdrawn is obviously an archetypal representation of the cosmic Christ. Parsival has become Christ. He has become a christened being. He has become the master, or the adept prince. His long hair hangs gracefully upon his forehead, and his forked beard is trimmed exactly as in the case of the traditional pictures of the Nazarene. When he removes his dark armor, he wears not the clothing he wore before, but the seamless white robe of the Essene priest. So Parsival stands now revealed as a parallel or a symbolic image, obviously drawn from the representations of Christ. There is a very beautiful and touching scene which follows, in which, in the form of Christ, he is accepted by Kundry. Parsival sits down upon some rock by the side of the stage, and at his feet is a little pool. and he is barefooted, or at least his sandals are removed. And while he is there, Kundry washes his feet and dries them with her hair, exactly as is told in the Bible. And there is a very touching situation develop of the strange recognition which she has that this is no longer an ordinary person, but someone who is great of destiny and who has come to accomplish the redemption of the Grail. And then, led by Gunamons, Parsival, holding up the great spear of Longinus and accompanied by Kundry, climb the mountain together. The three climb the mountain to attend the great occasion of the sacrament of the Grail, the Good Friday mystery. And this time they enter also rather quietly and inoffensively. But as the nights gather and all these rituals go on, we see Parsival and Kundry and Gunamons watching. No longer is he the gander looking for the goose, but he is simply standing patiently and quietly by, waiting. And at the time when Amfortas is supposed to elevate the host in the highest point of the ritual, Amfortas suddenly staggers. He falls partly. He breaks into tears. He realizes that he has failed. He prays for death, for liberation, anything to relieve him of the agony of attempting to perform this spiritual virtue, this wonderful mystery, when he knows this pain, this wound of worldliness or failure in his own side. And in the midst of this lamentation, Parsival comes forward, carrying in his hand the spear. And he touches the wound of Amfortas with the spear point, and the wound is immediately healed. Then the knights, Gunamons, the entire assembly, and Kundry, and Amfortas bow in recognition of the spiritual destiny of Parsival. He then takes over and completes the Eucharist, elevating the host. And at the same time, the voice of angels is heard in the music from the great dome of the temple. And the dead king Titurel rises in his casket to bless the occasion. Kundry, coming forward, kneels, and suddenly, with the motto of the Prince of Wales, "I serve," she falls dead at the foot of the cup. And Parsival, as he elevates the Grail cup, performs the completion of the ritual, and the mysterious symbol of the presence in the form of the dove, in the likeness of the Holy Ghost, descends and hovers over the cup. And the cup gleams and glows, and the blood of the king moves within it, and the glory of the Grail is restored, and the sacred rite goes on, and Parsival is king of the Grail, fulfilling the prophecy and relieving Amfortas of his long and terrible and bitter curse. Thus we have the essential substance of the story. There are many details, but that carries the general theme. Now the story continues, of course, somewhat in the account of Lohengrin, because Lohengrin, although he is of a different background, this part of the Parsival story being very largely Spanish, the part we have just heard of, based upon a large legend which does not appear actually much in the opera, which is German. We have the Lohengrin, which is essentially a Belgian story and is even centered in Brabant, which is a part of the Belgian area. Lohengrin can only serve and live in the world and marry his beloved under the question or under the condition she never asks who he is or where he came from. But under a new group of temptations, the wife asks Lohengrin the fatal question. She demands to know his name and the place from whence he came. Then he declares in a magnificent piece of singing, which I think is one of the finest parts of Lohengrin, his true narrative story, concluding with the lines, "My father is Parsival, and I am Lohengrin." And he reveals that his father is the king of the Grail. Of course, after this he has to depart, because that is the law which governs him. But the story of Lohengrin goes on and extends certain phases of the Grail legend, but does not add too completely anything more to the essential theme. It is a magnificent music work dedicated to the idea of the great service that these knights are performing, and the fact that they must always operate in secret. Their true identities must never be known. That is part of the obligation by which they are bound. Now let us go back for just a moment and consider a few parallels that will give us something to do in connection with the idea of this Monsalvart. Of course, all of you who are here, living here now, have seen our planetarium up here on this little ridge of hills, and every time I look at it, I can't help but think of Monsalvart on the mountains of Spain. It's almost represented as that kind of a building, only much more magnificent and massive, because it was built by angels, they say, in a single night. But anyway, it was a sacred building. And this building on the top of the mountain, where the gods or the priests of the Grail, the great order of chivalry, assembled to perform its rituals and rites, obviously has a reference, as in the case of Meru and most of the other sacred mountains, Asgard and Olympus, to the human skull and to the mountain temple of man himself. Here we have man divided into three worlds. This division we can trace all the way right back to the writings of Aristotle, who was one of the first to notice that the human body is divisible into three great areas or openings, which are called the abdominal cavity, the thoracic cavity, and the cranial cavity. And these three each contains some very important and vital part of man. The abdominal cavity is always the underworld. And in one of the early editions of Dante, the course of Dante, and in another case the course of Aeneas in the legend of the Aeneid, the difficult, strange, twisting underworld is represented in the form of the human intestinal tract. It's quite an amazing thing, but evidently the human body was well and early recognized as symbol of the three worlds. The human world at that time was regarded as a sort of a platter or a plate, in the midst of which, on the flat surface of which, in the midst of it was a mountain. And on the top of this mountain, which went way on up through into the sky, was the house of the gods way above. And sometimes this mountain was in the form of a tree or an axis, as we find it among the Jains of India, and also in Japan, and in the Yggdrasil tree of the Nordic peoples. Well, the tree, of course, is the spinal cord, or spinal column, and it is also the ladder of 33 rungs, which has to do with the sacredness of the number 33, which occurs in religion and also appears again in the 33 degrees of modern masonry. And of course, through these three worlds, we have a concept of a complete kind of anatomical geography. The large flat middle land, which is called by the Nordics Midgard, or the home of men, obviously refers to the diaphragm, which sort of divides this upper world, or the middle world rather, from the lower one. And on the top of the diaphragm is the mysterious temple of the heart, which is the center of this system. Now the spinal column goes on and on and on up, and finally it terminates in the pons of the medulla in the brain. And here we have another very wonderful building. Aristotle says, divided from the rest of the body by an isthmus called the neck. I like that statement, an isthmus called the neck. So if you don't know what your neck is or what you are wearing your collar on, it is an isthmus. In any event, the medical sciences of ancient times and even medieval and modern times seem to have played into this idea, because as the spinal cord ascends into the brain, it passes two little bodies called the pyramids, which seems to be a rather interesting kind of phenomenon. And you will remember how the gods and goddesses in ancient times are supposed to have had their particular abodes on the Palatine Hill. Well, the Palatine Hill suggests a little bit the palate, and apparently was originally intended to mean that. Now, in your Christian Bible, we have references to Golgotha, the place in the skull, which is the literal meaning of the word, and Calvary, or Calvarius, a bear skull. And we know that the Egyptians and most other people recognized the brain, or particularly the skull which enclosed it, as a kind of domed building on the top of a mountain where the gods dwelt. In the Vedic lore of India, the old and anatomical books of the Hindus, it is said that the Ganges River, which is the spinal cord, arises in the mountains at the very north of the empire and descended to water all parts of India. And of course, this sacred river, rising in the brain and rising in the ancient symbols from the head of the god Shiva, suggests very strongly the spinal cord, which occurs again as the Jordan and the Nile and practically all the sacred rivers of the world. Now, the Hindus also say that there are caves called the Caves of Ganga in the northern part of India at the very top of the mountains, and that in these caves, which are the ventricles and are also the convolutions of the brain, dwell the Arhats, the Rishis, the sages, and the great ones who are the teachers of mankind. And in this great dome temple also is the secret government of the world, which is supposed to be centered in the Gobina, or the sacred desert of Gobi, or the temple there, or in Shambhala, or in Meru. Now, it is also curious that there should be 12 convolutions to the human brain surrounding the great central section. These have been referred to as the 12 gods of Olympus, the 12 patriarchs, the 12 prophets, and the 12 disciples. And you will remember that at the time of the Last Supper, Jesus told his disciple to go into the village and find a certain house, and go into the house and ask that the upper room be made available, and that in this upper room would the Passover be held. And the upper room, of course, seemingly refers again to this upper part of the brain. Now, within the brain there are two little organs called the pineal gland and the pituitary body. The pituitary body is located directly behind the bridge of the nose and the reverse side in a little thing called the sala turcica, or the Turkish saddle, on the inside of the sphenoid bone, directly behind the bridge of the nose, marked approximately by the place where the Indian places his caste mark, or in mythology, the third eye of the god was placed in Asiatic art. And this little gland is in the form almost of a bottle. It is a kind of cup-like body structure with a stem, and it looks very much like one of the old alchemical retorts, kind of a bottle with a twisted neck coming out of the side of it. It has an anterior and a posterior lobe, and it's quite an involved little gland, and it empties into or discharges into the great ventricular space, which lies directly behind it and which is called the third ventricle. At the same time, at the rear of the head, almost directly under the crown of the head, where the priest shaves his head, or where the tonsure, referred to by St. Paul, was traditionally given, there is another little gland which is called the pineal gland, named from the pine cone due to its shape. And this little gland has a long projecting point on it, which also faces into the third ventricle. Well, in ancient symbolism, these two glands were always associated with holy relics or sacred things, and there is every reason to assume that these which represent polarization within the brain, the spear of Longinus representing the positive or male pole, and the cup or the vessel representing the female or negative pole, that these two poles are represented in the human brain by these two glands, the pineal corresponding to the spear of Longinus and the pituitary to the sangreal or holy cup. It is in this mysterious third ventricle which corresponds to the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, that the great alchemy of the marriage of the sun and moon of the ancient Rosicrucian alchemists is said to have taken place. And it is in the electrical magnetic field accompanying this phenomena that the mysterious Star of Bethlehem is said to make its appearance. The sacredness of this area is the origin, of course, of surrounding the head with a nimbus of light, which is called a halo. And the reports that were made recently that the halo was used first on the statue of St. Peter in Rome because of the deprivations of certain birds, I do not think is quite correct. I would suggest it be passed over, because the halo is to be found in all parts of the world, and it always represents the field of spiritual magnetic activity surrounding the central ventricles of the brain. So here we have the possible concept of the complete temple of Montsalvat. We have it raised upon the mountains. We have it divided from the underworld, or the world of the passions and desires. And we have it combined by means of a path which leads from the top, Montsalvat, down into the valley where once stood the ancient castle of Klingsor the magician. We are reminded, therefore, by these two of a point that Wagner may very well have been aware of, namely that he is really setting up a bit of geography reminiscent of St. Augustine's City of God. For here we have the City of God, Montsalvat, on the top of the mountain, and its polar opposite, Babylon, the City of Death, located in the valley below. We have, therefore, the journey of the soul from death up the mountain to immortality, following the 33 steps of the ancient rituals, and ever remembering that this journey is, of course, the journey home, or the journey to light, or the journey of the quest. Because if Kundri, or the spinal fire, is turned from the Muladhara chakra upward through the various members of this great system of flowers or spinal lotuses, it finally strikes the 1,000-petal lotus in the brain, in the midst of which is seated the palace of the gods, the golden heart, which is the emblem of Shambhala, or of the invisible hierarchy governing the world. Thus, as man is governed by the brain, by the gods dwelling in the ancient ventricular and convolutional orifices, so the world is said to have its brain upon Meru, and here Brahma and his deities administer the universal plan. In the Buddhist it is, of course, Shambhala, the great city of the north. And in every religion and every faith, the gods ruling from their ancient mountains have governed the fates of men. And of course it would be quite natural, where we have the Wagnerian approach without priesthood, that it would represent the pilgrimage of the truth seeker, who as Parsival represents the truth seeker in every human being. This seeker, ascending to various degrees of unfoldment, finally takes upon himself the full attributes of the true hero of the world. And of course in this case Wagner is emphasizing the hero as the Christos, or the symbol of the perfected human being. This is not the Jesus of Peter, but the Christ of Paul. It is the symbol of the divine being, the Christ in you, which if it be lifted up, will draw all things unto it. So that this is the raising of the Christ in us, and therefore the guileless fool, the innocent human being, gradually passes through these transformations. And when he returns to the castle, he returns in the full glory of his attained spiritual identity with the principle of universal salvation. So that he is then able to heal the wound of Amfortis. In other words, he is able then to remedy the darkness, ignorance, or pain of mankind. He overcomes the wound of the flesh, the symbol of mortality, ignorance, and death, and becomes the master of the Grail rites and mysteries. The knights gathered around in the great circle around the high throne of the Grail therefore represent, as in the case of the church, the symbol of the human body, because the great cathedrals of Europe were all cruciform. That is, they were in the form of the human body, and in each case the high altar was placed where the head would be. This is a very common and usual practice, not only in Christian temples, but in practically all of the ancient pagan buildings. It will be found at Karnak and Luxor and Edfu, and wherever sanctuaries had been built. Thus, the story of Parsival has several different levels of understanding associated with it. From the most physical standpoint, or the most personal standpoint, perhaps the one which Wagner wished most to emphasize was the creation of a new way of life for man, a way essentially founded in humanism, a way in which each individual became the truth seeker and achieved his own identity with truth. The creation of a new society, a new way of life, which was very close to Wagner's metapolitical contemplations and meditations. I do not think there is any ground for assuming that he intended Parsival to represent the Super Teuton or anything of that nature. I think actually he represents the true Superman, not the materialistic Superman of Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, but man as the true adept self, the true spiritually awakened being or creature, who has come into his wisdom and into his power, and who has therefore become the high priest of the mysteries of the Grail, which of course represent the mysteries of life itself. On other levels, we find this entire ritual moving gradually into almost a ceremonial of initiation into the old mystery rites. You can almost see the theologies of the Greeks, the Persians, and the Egyptians live again in this magnificent ceremonial. We also find within it many hints of alchemy, many suggestions relating to the ultimate quest for the philosopher's stone. For this philosopher's stone is Exodus, the stone of the Grail. And also we have the art of transmutation, represented by the healing of the wound of Amphotis. And we have, of course, the elixir of life or of immortality in the actual living substance moving in the Grail cup. So the whole thing can be considered a chemical experiment in which, through the union of sun, moon, and Mercury, or heaven, earth, and man, as the Chinese would call it, the great mystery of redemption is achieved. We will have within it a physiological account of processes taking place within the body and of psychological processes taking place within consciousness, where all of the elements of the Grail legend can be reinterpreted in terms of the dream symbolisms and of the archaic symbolisms which man finds so archetypal in his own personal psychological research into himself. The whole thing may be regarded as a great vision, as a great dream, and the magnificent music of it rising in the wonderful improvisation upon the theme of the great Dresden Amen goes on and on and on until it seems as though actually the music carries you into another world. It is a very exalting thing. Wagner learned the tremendous power of music and consciousness, and there is perhaps no one who has used music for the purpose of direct instruction more completely than Wagner has done so. And when I mean in complete instruction, I mean that he has taught or achieved the communication of idea by sound. It is more than a mere carrying of a mood. Through his leitmotifs and things of that nature, he has actually made music into an articulate language so that you can experience with him and you can intellectually comprehend through sound alone. So that you actually have the story plus a very important overtone, namely that you have the story touching on the level of vibration. And study from a standpoint of extrasensory perception of the patterns created by the Wagnerian music is really quite an important thing. It gives us and reveals to us Wagner's music as architectural. There is a massive architectural quality which seems to build into houses and temples and buildings. Instead of being magnificent floating patterns or undulating forms, as in so many of the composers, it seems as though this music puts an invisible stone upon stone and builds an exact architectural archetype, until actually, before the opera is finished, Wagner has built in the energy field of music the complete pattern of the Temple of Montsalvat. He has made this building exist in the invisible world of sound. And thousands and millions of persons down through the century, since it was compiled or produced, have had this tremendous experience of the opera as a kind of initiation into an ancient ritual, into a wonderful story. When you leave the opera, if you have been receptive to it, you feel as though you have come from a great cathedral, almost as though you had attended High Mass at St. Peter's or something of that nature. You feel the tremendous sanctity of it, but with one difference. You feel this sanctity as a very personal thing within yourself. You do not feel it as something in which others are involved. It is all something that happens to you, which is the very principal part of the whole concept of the Grail Order, namely that all these things are known within self, and that it is indeed this Christ or Parsival in you that is the hope of glory, that in some mysterious way you are seeing or hearing or feeling or sensing a process of alchemical transmutation taking place within your own consciousness. Of course, the mood passes, a few hours cannot hold it, but at the same time it has been as though you visited another world or went into the temple of another faith or into some strange mysterious world just beyond your own, and there you have a certain valid report or a certain understandable, knowable, recognizable statement of the entire concept of mysticism. You have had a kind of personal enlargement, a personal glimpse of what might be lying upon those mountains far beyond the borders of northern Spain, this invisible temple floating in the air. This mysterious order of knights represent an ever-presence of help, of light, of truth, of reality. And some way every human being becomes part of that order of knighthood. Some are the pages, some are the squires, and some are the knights. But the world becomes a great order of chivalry, centered around this temple and the ever-flowing cup of life which is enshrined there. And the knights are the servants of the ever-flowing life of space. And this ever-flowing life, the blood in the cup, is of course the same thing as the Chinese Tao. It is the symbol of universal life which sustains all things and pours from the wounds of the infinite by which the finite exists. Bemy, the German mystic, explains this, how the cleansing blood, or the mystery of the lifeblood, sustains all things, and we all have our lives because of the blood of the sun, because of the light in the air and the earth, and that all this is the blood of the Logos, the great power of life, so that all things, all creatures become part of the orders of the quest. They become citizens of this invisible empire that extends out through all the fields of service and benevolence and is seated in the mysterious temple that is not made by the hands of men, a temple built by angels, which is a symbol of the great house of Solomon, a house eternal in the heavens. This symbolism is all very rich and very mysterious. Of course, you bring to it what you have. It means what it means to you primarily. But it also, like all good instruction, like a well-fashioned Tibetan or Chinese or Japanese mandala, it calls out of you all that it can It becomes an outer symbol or picture of an inner conviction. And if you can move out to meet it, it becomes a tremendously moving, vital, and real thing. I think that any individual who has the opportunity to see the opera should do so, and perhaps many times, because in Wagner you have to see Tristan anywhere from 40 to 50 times before you even really hear it. And you probably will have to see or hear Parsival as often as is possible in the average person's lifetime, because it is not awfully frequent that we are given the opportunity. But we must hear it and see it many times, because it is overwritten in so many mysterious ways. Even a careful study of the score will not convey all of the overtones. You always learn something else. You always observe, notice some new or strange combination of tones, and you are being told a story. The story meet and mingle like an experiment in chemistry, and each new mingling has an important part to play in the total picture. So the more often you see it, the better you will sense its meaning, and also the more completely you will be able to identify its ritualism and symbolism with your own studies, because each time something new will be seen. I like to think of the Grail cycle, as Wagner gives it to us, as his contribution, as his New Testament in the great sacred writing which he compounded out of the two great descents, the Walsung and the Sennaboden. And these two descents, the Old and New Testament, the Old and New Dispensation, show first of how the world of human ambition and even of divine will, the great world of the law, slowly fell into space. And out of that old world grew the new world, the world of the new dispensation, the world that was not governed by law but by love, and that this love is the perfect law, and that there is nothing in law which is not perfected in love, and that law and love are really the same thing. Law is love seen from the outside, and love is law and actually seen from the inside. Thus, actually, the law and the prophets are not in conflict. The man who breaks the law is aware of the law. The man who does not break the law beholds the law as love. Thus, through obedience, law disappears in love. And that which was originally the struggle for existence becomes the glorious unfoldment of redemption. All of this, it seems, is contained in this wonderful double cycle, and perhaps for that reason we are strangely and profoundly indebted to the genius of Richard Wagner. I think that is our subject for the official title of Genghis Khan, who very nearly made it a fact. If it hadn't been for a poor little country that is now having a lot of trouble, Hungary, he probably would have been king of Europe as well as of Asia. In any event, this mysterious John the Presbyter was a force to conjure with, and he had quite a part to play in the development of America, inasmuch as the early voyagers seeking a new route to Asia were primarily concerned in visiting the court of Prester John, King of Kings, Emperor of all the world. Now this man was so fabled in his glory and his greatness that it is said that he lived in a wonderful world surrounded by a desert of gold. And in this the sea of golden sand swam fishes of emeralds and jade and silver. And he was served by a tremendous retinue. 72 kings were his body servants. 144,000 dukes waited on him. And his chefs consisted of 72 bishops. He really had quite an establishment out there somewhere. The only difficulty is no one was ever able to find it. And although the letters and messages which he sent are still in existence, no one ever discovered who Prester John was, or what his mysterious empire was like. We are not surprised, therefore, that he arises in the songs of the troubadours. And Prester John plays a very important part in our Grail story, as we will see in a moment. But anyway, in the great cycle of Roland, the story of the hero of the court of Charlemagne, the Sir Galahad, the Robin Hood, the Siegfried of the Charlemagne cycle, we learn of the wonderful help that Prester John sent to Charlemagne. And we learn also that by magic heroes traveled through the air to visit the empire of Prester John. It was all very curious, all very secret, and much in the spirit of the strange things reported by Apollonius of Tyana when he returned from India, or the even stranger and more wonderful things described by Sir Marco Polo in his experiences. Polo's stories of the magic, mystery, sorcery, and wonder of the East, these stories were considered so extravagant that on his deathbed he was asked to recant and correct his extravagances in order that he might not go into the other world as a branded liar. Marco Polo on his deathbed said he'd only told half the story, and the only way he could go into the other world as a liar was by taking back what he had said. So the fate of Sir Marco in the other world is still open to some controversy. But all these legends seemingly had a pattern. They have a place in the world, because after Parsival had finished his kingship of the Grail, it is said in one of the most serious of the great stories that he journeyed to the east. Now you might think that such a thing would be a long way from the thinking of Christian Europe, even in the days of the troubadours. But we know that the Mongols, even before the time of Genghis Khan, had been quite active in trading along the caravan routes with Europe, and many strange and interesting legends, bits of folklore, tales, had come along these routes. Among them many that later show up in the journals of Columbus, who seems to have been very sensitive to this type of thinking. In any event, the contact between Europe and Asia was not as thin as we think. As a result of a council of the churches much earlier, the Nestorian Christians had been declared heretical and had been sent into the desert and wilderness with the hope that they would perish. These Nestorians, however, were able to survive, and they carried on and they journeyed into far places. And there are Christian monuments today in China, raised before the 5th century, bearing witness to the presence of Nestorian missionaries. Thus there was a direct contact between the Near East and the Mediterranean and China as early as the 2nd century A.D., a contact which led to a considerable exchange of art, culture, literature, even music and language. This is not any more surprising, of course, than the still earlier contact established in India, particularly in the Gandhara region, as a result of the expeditions of Alexander the Great. So the East and West were not as strange or separate as Kipling might cause us to believe. And the contacts and legends of these two regions were fairly well established. During the reign of Kublai Khan, the illustrious descendant of the great Genghis, a delegation was sent to the Pope from Mongolia. This delegation visited the Pope while he was enthroned in Avignon as a result of one of the eternal ecclesiastical feuds that were dividing the church at that time. This delegation told him, among other things, that there existed in Asia at that time a Christian empire, a very strange and mysterious place, ruled over by John the Presbyter, a very mysterious and elusive person. And John the Presbyter himself sent epistles to the Pope, to the Doge of Venice, to the Dukes of Florence, and to many other important persons of his time, always signing himself John the Presbyter, King of Kings, Emperor of all the world. Now this modest title, of course, he came by legitimately because that was also the Arthurian legend, or the story of the age of chivalry, and much, if not all, of the legend of Roland and the paladins of Charlemagne, King of the Franks. We have in the cycles of these legends many implications of deeper and double meanings, but only from the perspective of a more enlightened era can we examine in some detail the interlocking of these stories. We have to therefore assume that while it is not impossible that the Arthurian cycle had a certain foundation in history, that it was largely an embellishment. Perhaps some small and inconsequential group of events became the basis of that great cycle which Tennyson has preserved for us in the Idylls of the King. The same is true of the story of Charlemagne. The historical Charles the Great is not in every way the Charlemagne of the epic cycle. It is quite possible that there may be some historical foundation for the Lohengrin epic in Belgium, and there is perhaps a remote historical ground for the great cycle of Parsival. Actually, however, these historical elements are of no great importance. They are so completely submerged in the larger meaning that it is scarcely necessary to re-identify them. For practical purposes, we of course realize that the Grail cycle, as Wagner took hold of it, was a scattered group of works. Several, particularly the Titurel stories, arising in Germany and actually traceable directly to the great bardic singers of the troubadours. While mentioning this, we might also note that St. Francis of Assisi was also a troubadour. So was Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio. All of these men, therefore, may be suspected, and their writings are always suspect. To take the writings of Dante, for example, when he explains how he climbs out of the pits of the underworld on the body of Satan, this seems like wild fantasy. And his romance, his romantic childhood attachment for Beatrice, appears to be merely the story of a very emotional and impressionable youth. But behind all these things are other Last week we discussed something of the legendary and lore behind Wagner's great cycle of the Ring. And this evening we must approach the New Testament of this epic, the Wagnerian cycle of the Grail. And as in the previous cycle, he drew heavily upon what might be termed folklore, but particularly upon the legends of the troubadours. We have tried at various times in lectures and books to tell you something about the troubadours. These mysterious singers and ballad writers who have been passed off largely as a band of wandering minstrels, but who actually represented a very closely integrated, highly organized group of men with very deep and real spiritual, philosophical, and even political activities in the backs of their minds. The troubadours seem to have inherited something of the mysteries of the ancient Orphic bards. And like the Druidic bards, they were not only the perpetuators of ancient tales, but they composed a great many, or created new patterns and arrangements, by which they deepened and broadened the implications of folklore and legendary. At a time when frank statement was impossible, these priests of secret cults exercised a tremendous influence in Europe. And many of the great epics which have descended to us as the priceless examples of early medieval literature are traceable directly to them, and upon the tremendous store of lore which they left, countless more recent dramas, stories, legends have been built. Now, in the case of the Parsival story, we know that we are dealing with a very definite collection of these cyclic myths. A collection which includes not only the Parsival Lohengrin stories, but also the entire cycle known as the Arthur Intense. And as we begin to penetrate them, we realize why it was necessary and how it was necessary in those days of tremendous mental oppression to hide very choice and important truths in these fables and myths. The story of the Grail cycle begins apparently at the time when the Roman Emperor Vespasian was laying siege to the city of Jerusalem. At that time, he was assisted by the leaders and upholders and followers of a group or tribe called the Senaborden. This family was of unknown origin, but from a study of the names of the sons and relatives of the house, we may suspect an Arabic background. Now, this is all the more interesting when we discover that the oldest form that we have of the Parsival story came from the Arabs of Spain during a certain period in their sphere of cultural influence. One time, of course, they dominated all European thought. This Senaborden family intermarried with the nobility of Europe, and as a result of the help given to the Roman emperor, they became a powerful family after the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. And among the descendants of this family, after several generations, was Titurel, the first king of the Grail. Now, this man is also subjected to a wide cycle of myths, and historically, almost nothing is known about him. He is tied in, however, by the troubadours into other cycles other than the Grail cycle, and occurs for us in a number of different forms and appearances. It is said that this was the one, however, this great and noble prince, who received a vision from heaven, instructing him to build the great temple for the Grail. And he was told by angelic voices where to select the place on how to go about this wonderful project to which he was predestined and foreordained. The place selected was said to have been on the mountains between Christian and Muslim Spain, in a location difficult to establish, although efforts have been made to give it historical orientation. Anyway, this palace was called the Palace on Mount Salvat, and apparently it was patterned after the concept of the mysterious Lodge of the Adepts in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia.